Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and yesterday when I was doing some light reading online, I did a little further digging into it afterwards. I came across a theory that I thought was a little comical at first, but when I looked into it further, it makes a lot of sense when I really thought about it. And I want to talk about this for a minute because I think it's a wonderful segue into something that I talk to you guys about often. I used to really cover a lot back in about 2014, and I think this year I want to rehash on this topic a bit because it was really popular back then. And that was talking about the masculine identity crisis that we have in young men today. And it's something I see particularly strong in young men who are starting to work out, young men who are going to bodybuilding and forums and things. A lot of them, really due to upbringing and social changes, are in an identity crisis because they simply do not know how to be men anymore. Our society in the West as a whole has pushed us away through a host of reasons from the ability to be men, the ability to have appropriate outlets for the inherent violence that is simply part of being male, being hormonally and genetically male, how to find positive, constructive outlets for this, as well as not having rites of passage anymore in our societies for men. Now, when we look at this main villain in The Force Awakens, the new Star Wars, we have Kylo Ren. What we have is a really an interesting guy. I mean, he's one of the more interesting villains we've had in any movie and in this series because of the fact that he represents what we see exactly in these boy childs today, these young men who maybe don't have a positive male role model, they've not gone through proper rites of passage, they don't know how to maintain any sort of relationship, even romantic relationships, because they don't know how to be a man, so they have no idea how to be a man in any sort of relationship. And so they lean towards a lot of antisocial behavior, a lot of negative stereotypes, a lot of repressed anger, a lot of repressed aggression and lashing out and behaving like children. And that's exactly what we see with Kylo Ren. He has serious anger management issues. He lashes out like a little child. He throws temper tantrums, something that you would never expect to see in any sort of mature adult male over the age of about 19 or 20. It's behavior that you expect of a little child, so that we see more and more of today in so-called men. And it's interesting when you look at his background because he technically comes from strong stock, basically. I mean, his mother, Princess Leia, was a warrior, very much so. Her father was Han Solo, was pretty much a swashbuckler of the galaxy and a warrior and a scallion. But I think maybe his father's role in all of that is what's been suggested is why he doesn't know how to be a man. He might have had great genetics to be very manly and a powerful leader and an amazing warrior, but he doesn't have the aptitude, and it could largely be because, again, you have the absent father syndrome going on here. He has a father who's out gallivanting the universe rather than staying at home and teaching him, his offspring, how to actually be a man, teaching him some masculine values, giving him a positive role model. And I think his failure to have that through his father and his upbringing, he then turns to his grandfather, who he never met, who was evil, was a probably historically, at least in the recent generation, one of the most single powerful forces of evil and darkness in their galaxy. And he then sees him as a role model because his father never taught him anything. And he's like, well, I want to be strong. I want to be powerful. I want to be a man. And my grandfather was strong and powerful. And so he idolizes him and accepts on this very negative role just in an attempt to validate himself and validate his own masculinity. And I think that's absolutely fascinating when you look at the psychology of this villain. And I think it's interesting that we see this personified in a modern movie that is a massive box office hit, because it does allow us to segue into this problem we have with current young men. Many of them behave like this. The most extreme example that we saw, again, struck us in the fitness community, was Elliot Rogers. He had the same sort of behavior and psychology that we see in Kylo Ren. He had this massive anger issues, this pent-up aggression. He had no idea because his stuff came out. People saw a lot of it. It got all over the internet because he posted on like bodybuilding.com and stuff, and he was trying to be a pickup artist and everything. He had massive insecurities. He had a massive identity crisis, and he had no concept of what it is to be a man in any way. And look at the terrible consequences. He was effectively Kylo Ren on a smaller scale. He went on a killing spree, and his final outlet for his pent up aggression and identity crisis and resentment towards women for rejecting him was an act of mass violence and anger that ended up in the death of quite a few people. And again, this is what we see in these situations. This is one of the reasons we definitely see so much violent crime in young men. We see so many young men who really, in honesty, have no clue how to pick up women. A lot of them join the gym. And that's where it hits our community, because I see this on such a massive scale, talking to my audience, looking at forums, things like that, looking at what goes on in this community, even talking to young men at gym. So many of these young men at gyms, because our society hasn't given them proper rites of passage. They don't know when they're supposed to be a man. They don't know how to be a man. And so they get the idea that, well, maybe if I go lift weights, that's masculine. They didn't have a rite of passage. They're not hunters. They're not warriors. They didn't go through these things that we've done all through traditional society. And men need these things. We need rites of passage. We need these things for our personal identity. And people are trying to build a genderless society, and it doesn't work. What that actually causes is psychosis, anxiety, insecurity in men. And so again, that's what we're seeing. And these young men are they have no clue how to be a man, so they go lift weights because that seems like it might be masculine. That might make them into a man. And for some of them it helps. For a few guys out there, that becomes part of a rite of passage. They get a brotherhood, because again, that's something young men need. They need a brotherhood to teach them certain values and to again teach them to be men. And so they bond with the other men at the gym. They become sometimes their circle of friends, and again, they have that sense of brotherhood at that point, and they have that sense that they are doing something masculine. And for some of them that works. It helps them make that transition into manhood better. But for a lot, it doesn't seem to help. They still seem to be insecure. They still seem to not grasp what it is to be a man on any level, what the ethics of being a man are, what the responsibilities of being a man are. And so that's something I'm definitely going to talk about in future videos a little bit again. I used to talk about it a lot in the past, and I think it's something we really need to look at inside of our community, because we see our community in and of itself is oftentimes a gateway for young men who didn't have proper role models to come in and try to do so. But we also have a lot of really bad, negative so-called father figures in this community who are not helping these guys, or just scamming them and taking advantage of them, because we have a lot of really insecure young men coming into the fitness world. And I think those of us, this older generation who grew up in a different time, to where some of us still had our rites of passage, as our hunting and other things that we did, that we saw on a larger level. And we had basically these male traditional values passed down to us by our grandfathers, and in many cases our fathers, but for me, definitely my grandfather, that we have at least some social obligation. Because again, part of being a man is understanding your obligations, understanding your duty. And those of us who understand that have some definitely obligation and duty to help this next generation of young men really start to understand what it is to be men again, and to fight against this whole concept of this gender neutral society. Because when you look at the sheer number of young men I see with an identity crisis, it's very clear that this has been a catastrophic failure. And when I talk to the number of young women that I know out there, friends, particularly friends, family friends, things like that, the guys that they try to get involved with and stuff, there's so many man boys out there that it's just a complete turnoff to a lot of these women. And there are issues with women too, and I think that's part of the thing too. There's definitely an identity crisis with young women, because they don't know how to be women anymore to any extent. And people do need to understand that there are biological and hormonal intrinsic differences between the two. It's not a bad thing to celebrate those differences and identify them and accept them for what they are. In fact, it's far more emotionally and psychologically healthy. But until young men start to be taught these values again, which we have done for all of recorded history, there's going to be this conflict here. And I think it actually causes the opposite of what the intended purpose is. It actually causes a lot of angst. It causes a lot of pent up aggression. And I think that actually contributes more towards male aggression towards females, and even things like sexual abuse and things like that out there, because you have again a generation of men who actually have no concept anymore of what it is to be a man. They end up a big part of that ends up with a resentment towards women, because women are not biologically wired to be sexually attracted to men who are not men. And that is a take-home point, that the whole metrosexual, sexually ambiguous male isn't biologically attractive to the vast majority of women. So these guys really struggle to find meaningful relationships, sometimes sexual relationships, things. So it actually creates a higher predisposition towards violence and aggression towards women, up to, in the worst cases, including sexual assault. So again, this is something that we really need to look at and take more seriously, and realize that this attempt to create a gender neutral society is actually causing more harm than it does good. And it's something that, again, those of us who know better, those of us who are in areas like this, public figures like fitness and weightlifting and things, or even my tactical channel, again, also by many accounts, I don't fully agree with that, a very masculine endeavor. And so we need to start looking closer at this and try to help this next generation of young men try to learn for themselves what it is to be men, so that we actually have a generation coming behind us who can actually run this society and take care of their business. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.